So there are a couple of interesting things that are going on in today's gospel lesson from Mark. Of course, there is that event that's known as the miraculous catch of fishes, but we'll get to that in a few minutes. Before that, though, I wanted to just take a minute or two and look at kind of the less miraculous part of the story. If you look at the Gospel of Luke as it is in the NRSV, New Revised Standard Version, or in the NIV, or most of the modern translations of the Bible, you find that this particular passage is headed up as Jesus calls the first disciples, or the calling of the disciples, or the first disciples, or something like that. And what's cool about this passage is that the calling of the disciples is one of those things that is actually covered in all of the Gospels. There aren't too many events like that. And I suppose it's natural because the Gospels were written by the disciples or by students of the disciples. And the people in the early church were interested in knowing how everything came together. They wanted to see the origin story of the church that they had been baptized into. Nowadays, people want to see how Peter Parker became Spider-Man, or Bruce Banner became the Hulk. Back then, those people wanted to see how their teachers, the disciples, were called into the church, called into service. And this was how the writers of the Gospels answered that question. And when you look at the various accounts that you find in the Gospels, you discover something kind of curious. I want to show you. We have that first slide. Print's a little small. But the very earliest surviving gospel is generally considered to be the Gospel of Mark. There are probably some earlier writings before this, but we can only guess at that. We don't have any existing copies. So we have the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark was written somewhere between 50 and 60 AD, or about a generation after the ministry of Jesus. And Mark, which Mark generally did, wrote a pretty straightforward account of the calling of the disciples. In fact, we have someone being called now. But when we read Mark, we read that Jesus was walking along the shore of Galilee when he saw Simon Peter and his brother Andrew casting their net into the sea, into the lake. And Mark tells us that Jesus saw them and he went, "Hey guys, follow me and I will make you, or I will send you out to fish for people." And then Mark tells us that they immediately dropped what they were doing and they followed him. And then a little bit further on down the shore, he saw James and John, the brothers, preparing their nets to fish, and he did the same thing. He said, "Hey guys, come with me." And they immediately left their father with the boat and the family business and the nets and everything else, and they followed Jesus. That's a fairly simple, straightforward account, right? Now, about 10 years after Mark, now we're talking between 60 and 70 AD, and now 2 full generations after Jesus, the Gospel of Matthew comes out. It's the bookstores. It shows up on Amazon. And now the faithful followers could look at chapter 4 in Matthew and see that it tells almost the same story. I mean, almost exactly the same. If you were the suspicious kind, you might think that maybe Matthew wasn't keeping his eyes on his own paper here. Because it looks an awful lot like Matthew went to Mark, copied and pasted into his thing, and changed just a few words so nobody would notice that it looked the same. But very, very similar. And now we go out a little bit further in the timeline. And we get to Luke. Luke is somewhere shortly after 70 AD. And Luke is writing for his patron, Theophilus. And he's trying to write an orderly account of how the ministry of Jesus happened. And if you put it alongside the Gospels of Mark and Matthew, you notice that something has happened. Because this simple account from the earlier Gospels has now morphed with time. And there are now more details to the story. Luke tells us that Jesus has been teaching. And he sees this boat here, and he sees the people coming, and he asks Simon Peter to put out from shore so that he, Jesus, can sit on the boat and teach everybody who's gathered. And then the call comes, but it's after Jesus has been teaching for a bit. And it's not the same call that we read in the first two Gospels. Because what does Jesus do? After he's been preaching for a little bit, Jesus turns to Simon Peter and he says, "Hey, Simon, why don't you take this puppy out into the deep water and cast your nets?" We can guess that Simon maybe kind of rolled his eyes a little bit. He says, "You know, we've been working all night. We haven't caught anything. We're finally just getting everything clean and dry and all of that. And now, well," and he hesitated, and then he looked at Jesus and he said, "Do you know what? Since you're asking me to do it, I'll go." And out they go. Away from the familiar shoreline and now into the deep water. And they let down their nets, and all of a sudden they are up to their behinds in fish. Literally. Because as they drag in the nets, the fish are just falling out. And the fish just keep falling into the bottom of the boat and weighing it down until it is almost awash. It is almost ready to sink. And then they call another boat out to help, and that one starts to fill up. And now they're both struggling to get back to shore. And then Luke tells us that Simon Peter is so overwhelmed by what happened that he tells Jesus to get away. "Leave me." He says, "Go away from me, Lord, I'm a sinful man." Interesting reaction. But he says this because he realizes now after this that Jesus is something or someone very, very special. That he is standing in the presence of something divine. And what Simon Peter says echoes, consciously or not, echoes what Isaiah said in the passage that we read from the Old Testament. He basically says, "I'm a sinful man. Well, I shouldn't be here." And how does Jesus respond to that when Peter says, "Just, you know what, just go away. I'm not worth your time"? That's when Jesus makes the real call, because then he says, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you're going to be fishing for people." And then just as Mark and Matthew told us, the fishermen present, Simon and Andrew and James and John, they immediately when they get to shore, drop their nets and leave everything behind and follow. So it's a different account from what Matthew and Mark did, right? Because Mark and Matthew offer this kind of mysterious image of Jesus' recruiting style where he just goes up and says, hey, you, come here. And immediately whoever he's talking to just says, okay, I'll do that. And Luke tells us that the call came after Jesus had offered a sign to show who he was. And actually that makes a lot more sense. And just for the sake of completeness, there's one more. There's John. And John is very hard to read. I couldn't fit it up there with the other ones, but it's okay because John, again, what John does is he's kind of off in the weeds a little bit. Because John tells us that John the Baptist was the one who pointed Jesus out to a couple of his followers, and then the call came when the followers went to Jesus. And Jesus said, okay, why don't you follow him? John was writing about 90 to 100 AD, and that was 3 generations after Jesus' ministry. And he was trying to get across different points than the other gospel writers. So I'm not going to say that it contradicts the others, but it is, in detail and style, it's very different. So we can look at it and say, well, that's really interesting, but for our purposes, we're really looking at Mark and Matthew and Luke. And you look at those first 3 Gospels, and you can see this natural progression of the story. And tying it to a miracle, or at least what looks to us like a miracle, is fascinating. Because I think what Luke wanted to get across is that the disciples may have been acting on faith, but they were not acting blindly. They upended their lives for Jesus. They dropped everything they were doing to follow Jesus. But before they ever did that, Jesus had shown them that they were in the presence of something very special. And when you think about it, when I was thinking about it this week, I realized that in my experience at least, on the path that I have followed, God has always led me by first showing me or allowing me to experience these moments of power or moments, encounters with the divine. I don't have any better words for them. Before God ever encouraged me to take the next step in my faith journey, God showed me something special. And I think that's a pattern that we can look back and we can see as we look back on our own personal journeys of faith. It's as true for us as it was for the disciples back then. Even the miraculous catch of fishes. We look back at that and we see initially Simon just sort of shrugs his shoulders when Jesus tells him to put out into deep water. And he goes along with it. And even that moment happened because Simon had already experienced a sign from Jesus. Because in the previous chapter of Luke, chapter 4, verses 38 and 39, Luke tells us that that Jesus, who now had been ridden out of Nazareth on a rail, he went to Capernaum, and he went to the house of Simon, and he healed his mother-in-law from a fever. So Peter already knew that there was something going on. But when Jesus said, hey, you know what? Go out into the deep water, Peter was willing to listen. But you do have to wonder what was running through his head. At least I do. Because I think if you consider human nature and Simon Peter's own reputation for speaking out of turn, you can imagine this internal dialogue that was going on. And as they're pulling away from shore, away from the safety of the shoreline and going out into the deep water, Peter has to be thinking, man, just got everything cleaned up. We've been up all night, everybody's tired and cranky. Why are we doing this? We must be crazy. And then as they start to toss their nets into the water, he's thinking, you know, this is the same water, it's the same lake. What difference does it make if we fish here or if we fish there? This is a wild goose chase. We're going to get back to shore, and Jesus is just going to laugh at us. Maybe Jesus just wanted a boat ride. And then as the fish start to show up, and as they start to fill the boat, and as the water line gets closer and closer to the rail of the boat, threatening to swamp them all, I've got to think Simon Peter was thinking, great, now we're going to sink. Whatever was going through his head, by the time he finished fishing, Simon Peter knew he was in the presence of something or someone very special. And I think by the time they got to shore, at least, he was thinking, what next? And that's when Jesus extends his invitation. He says, come with me, we'll fish for people. You think this was a miracle? Wait till you see what's coming. And that's what Jesus does. Being called to serve Jesus, being called to follow him, it's not just a singular event, because there's always more to do. There's always a new need, there's always a new ministry or a new project that's waiting for us when we finish what we've been called to do. There's always deeper water for us to fish in. There are always places and circumstances we haven't experienced before, but which hold the possibilities of great spiritual reward. Jesus is the master of the stretch goal. That challenge to do just one more thing, to take one more risk, to go just a little bit beyond what we think we can do. Because the simple truth that Jesus knew is this, that at the end of a journey to a new destination, we still have a new horizon to reach for. For Simon and the first disciples, I think going out into the deep water was a metaphor. It was a metaphor for going outside their comfort zone. So this week, I want to just ask. Now, we've all done our spiritual assessments online, right? From a couple of weeks ago. I'm sure. Think about your spiritual gifts. Think about those things that you can do, those skills that you have. And ask yourself, what might Jesus be calling me to do? What is Jesus calling me to do?